I'm really pleased to introduce today's presenters, Dr. Zander Evans and Kerry Jones. Zander is the Executive Director with the Forest Stewards Guild. Prior to his current role, he was the Guild's Research Director for 11 years. His research supports on-the-ground implementation of ecological forestry. He has a PhD from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and he worked in the past as a cartographer and spatial analyst with the USGS. Kerry is a newly retired meteorologist, having worked for NOAA and the National Weather Service for 30 years, a majority of which was spent at the Albuquerque office, and more recently with the U.S. Forest Service Santa Fe National Forest for 4 years. Kerry focused on operational forecasting, fire weather and seasonal weather prediction, and served as an incident meteorologist and air resource advisor. He received a Bachelor of Science in Meteorology from the University of Oklahoma and a master's degree in water resources from the University of New Mexico. We are so excited to have Zander and Kerry join us today, and I will turn it over to them. Oh, you're muted, Zander.
Yes. Thanks so much, everybody. Rachel, thanks for the introduction. And I'm just going to go ahead and dive in because I have a lot of slides. So my portion is looking back at 2024 and trying to make some sense of the largest fires, and then I'll turn it over to Kerry. So just as a reminder, last year, overall, these are annual anomaly charts. It was hot. A number of degrees hotter than kind of the average, and I forget in this case where they pulled the specific average, but the important thing is it was hot, hotter than sort of maybe we have in our heads if we've been working here a long time. Also dry, but notably above average for total precipitation percentiles in northern New Mexico, but otherwise pretty dry, and in some places the driest. And then one of the charts that we like to look at again, Kerry is more expert on than I am, but just as a user, I find these very helpful. And these are the energy release component charts. And so this charts the amount of energy that would be available to a fire as it was burning. So it kind of combines a number of factors, temperature, fuel moisture, etc. And the full description is either on the website or in the report. But the point here is if you track the blue line in the beginning of March, in 2024, it was the maximum. So the red line is the 10-year maximum, or overall maximum, I guess I should say. And so, we hit some maximums, and that's not surprising, having just seen that temperature map. But then it dipped down even to some minimums at certain points of the year. And really what we see is where the ERC starts to head towards that maximum is when we have fires, essentially. And when they're creeping up above that 90 or 97th percentile line, that's often when we have our big fire. So it's a very useful chart to kind of track. And, you can look at some of the start dates of these fires based on the ERC chart. And they're different ERC charts for different regions within the Southwest. And just looking back at 2023, we hit more of those maximums in July. And so, that drives some of the fire behavior we saw in 2023 versus 2024. So another way to kind of get some context here, looking back over a long period, 20-year period, where we look at prescribed fire and wildfire. 24 looks somewhat similar to 23. And we'll talk about some of those totals. But generally, as you kind of look at the history, certainly in the more recent times, say from 2016 to now, there are fewer wildfire acres, and in many cases, fewer prescribed fire acres, with the exception of maybe 2020. So that's kind of the context that we're talking about. The fires we looked at, we look in depth at 10 of the largest fires across the Southwest, and these are all fires over 10,000 acres. And every year it's a little different. We try to look at about 10 fires, and usually those fires greater than 10,000 acres, but depending on how the fire year is, that can look a little different. But it's a way of trying to look at the most acres in the most in-depth. You really it takes some time, so we just don't have the resources to look at every fire. And this is a way we grabbed 85,000 acres out of the 356,000 acres. So it's a good chunk, but not even the majority. And we'll just briefly look at each of these in depth. We pull information from these sources, fairly standard databases and mapping tools. So the first one is the Wildcat Fire out in Arizona. That started in May and burned about 14,000 acres. We also, as you see here on the stats, we track the cost as well as the cause. So it's a human wildfire start, costs about $4 million. And in general, when we look at the soil burn severity, it burned with either low or moderate severity. But this was, and we'll get into the sort of overall classifications, but we lumped this in sort of a scrub class. When we built our classifications, we didn't really realize how many desert wildfires we would have, and this has obviously affected some saguaro deserts, and that's a whole sort of separate conversation, but I'd refer you to the recent publication that's on the Southwest Fire Science Consortium webpage about fire in the desert. The next fire started the next day, May 19th in New Mexico, and that was the Indios fire up in northern New Mexico. And this burned for a long time, about 12,000 acres. Fairly high cost at $15 million, but notably this was managed with strategies other than full suppression, as I think the way I should say it. And it did a lot of benefit, a lot of good for the forest up there. And so it did have some areas of high severity, but if you look at this is the canopy mortality map we're looking at. It had lots of acres of low or moderate. And some of those patches maybe got a little bit larger than, I don't know, managers may have wanted, but certainly some patchiness, some mortality is probably really good. And I really personally like this fire because it fits into some other great work happening nearby, the Encino Vista project on Forest Service land. And so it's part of bringing resilience back to this whole region in northern New Mexico, the Carson National Forest. So pretty cool fire. Next is the Antone fire in the Gila area, and that was about 12,000 acres. When doing these reports, there's almost always a fire in that neck of the woods. You can tell from both the picture as well as the map, mainly burned at very low severity, with a few patches where it opened up a little bit. But certainly one of the photos from the Antone fire is kind of classic in terms of low severity surface fire. Unfortunately, the next fire is just the opposite. The South Fork fire in Lincoln County, New Mexico, started in the middle of June. and cost about $23 million to manage and really had devastating effects. So this was just a really unfortunate fire. There are a couple other fires, the Blue 2 and the Salt Fire, that were right around it. We honed in on the South Fork, but really as the Ruidoso, that area has been hit very hard recently by wildfire. And you can see in this picture large acreage of high severity. This is again the canopy mortality map. So lots of trees dying, lots of watershed impacts, and lots of flooding post-fire. So just what we don't want. This is maybe the Indios fire isn't a perfect fire, maybe no fire is, but certainly you could contrast them and saying, well, Indios definitely had some good effects. South Fork had pretty horrible effects all around. Really, yeah, sad to see that much damage. And even sadder, it caused mortality. It killed 2 people. So, yeah, just horrible. The next fire on our list, the Freeman Fire. I think this is our largest fire, but also, fairly inexpensive to manage sort of on a per acre basis, and cost about $1.3 million. And we don't have a lot, we don't have mortality maps or soil burn severity maps. So this vegetation condition class map is one of the things we use. Well, if we still want to map it in some way and get some idea of what might have happened. And so what this is showing is that redder area is indicating areas that are out of historic condition. So, that may be a little bit tougher to map in some of these sort of scrub or chaparral areas, right? We could argue about what historic conditions might be, but gives you some sense of what's going on in the area. The Black Fire was the next fire to ignite, natural ignition, about $7 million in Maricopa County. And this, again, sort of, you can see from the swirls in the photo, sort of a desert fire. It gets classified in our system as scrub. Some patches of high severity, but low severity in a lot of places. But what does low severity mean in a ecosystem that may not be adapted to fire? Smarter people than I can weigh in on that. I know that there are a lot of experts on this call, so I may point questions to them. The Sandstone Fire was the next to ignite, about 27,000 acres, about $9 million to manage. And you can see again, a lot of grass burning in this nice photo, fair amount of low severity, sort of mixed. And one thing I'll point out here is how past fires form the control lines for this fire. So fires from 2020 and 2023 kind of helped provide the boundaries there, particularly on that west side. So one of the things we've been looking at over time with these fire season overviews is where the sort of history of fire lines up. And we do see some reburns. And I think maybe even our next fire is an example of that, or maybe it's the siphon. But the next fire was the Skeleton Fire, 24,000 acres. It burned mainly in August and $1.5 million. Again, sort of a lot of grass in this photo, and you can see some higher severity, but oh no, I'm sorry. That was just the mistake I was trying to avoid. This is the vegetation condition class. So we're seeing areas where the vegetation is within what we would expect for the historic range of variability, those yellow and green areas, and those are likely to be grassy areas. And then some areas where it may be more dense than historically in the red areas on this map. but again, we don't have the severity maps for this skeleton fire. The West Fire in Gila County, 15,000 acres, $20 million, and uh, some patches of high severity, likely, as you can see in this photo, due to some topography, but large sections of fairly light canopy mortality. The Siphon Fire, I believe it's the last fire here, 15,000 acres, $500,000 to manage. And yeah, this is one where we're seeing a reburn. So much of the Siphon Fire was reburning areas that had burned in 2020 or 21. Pretty rugged country. And yeah. I've got a couple slides that may be particularly useful for kind of wrapping our heads around the season. One is this on vegetation class. And obviously you can lump or split vegetation. We tend to lump to try to get sort of data that is more easily comparable year to year. That lumping is feeling somewhat problematic as we get into, as I've been sort of hemming and hawing about the desert fires, but a lot of those show up in that scrub category, some chaparral or conifer oak. And you can see that ponderosa pine, mixed conifer, pinon juniper didn't burn as fewer acres burned in those forest types than some years. Um, We also look at, you can kind of go back and compare year to year. And, some years we've had 80,000 acres or in Ponderosa or looks like almost 200,000 acres in Pinon juniper. So the vegetation type can vary considerably year to year based on sort of the precipitation and temperature patterns. So again, for 2024, when we look at the condition, the sort of how different from the historic range of variability the vegetation was, it did burn in a lot of areas that were moderately departed from historic conditions. But then you can see, for example, the Freeman burned a big chunk of acres that were not near historic conditions, highly departed. Canopy mortality. So what we see here is a lot of acres, sort of less than 50% mortality. But as we look at the greater than 90%, so essentially complete mortality, the South Fork fire really is dominating that. So if we could have avoided that fire, at least looking at these 10 fires, it wouldn't have been such a bad season. And soil burn severity, obviously we don't have mapping for all the fires, but soil burn severity, sort of the same story where a lot of low and unburned, and then we see South Fork dominating that moderate and high classifications. So I think, so I got a couple of themes, and then we'll turn it over to think about the coming year or the year that's already started, and then we'll open it up for questions. So these are pretty obvious, hot and dry again, right? Like this is just our lives now. In general, it's always this, we could just copy and paste this year to year, essentially. But that does kind of affect how we're thinking about all these fires, how we think about managing fires, et cetera. We're just in this hotter and drier world. Fewer acres burned than in the last 8 years, and so given the periodicity, it does feel like we may be setting up for a year where we have a lot of acres burned again. In terms of strategy, full suppression was used on more fires than in some years, and we There's a whole bunch of politics behind that, as I think we all know, and also managers make good decisions out in the woods, and the conditions just may not have been right for using strategies other than full suppression. Um, as I said, we're seeing a lot of scrub and chaparral burning as a percentage this past year versus something like ponderosa pine. But in general, we're seeing fairly low severities. So I think I will stop there and turn it over to Kerry. And I'll thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Zander. Are we going to do questions at the end, Rachel, or is now a good time?
We'll just do questions at the end. So if you want to start sharing your screen, that would be great.
All right. Well, good afternoon. How are we looking, Rachel? Is that good?
Looks good. If you just want to hit hide on that little pop-up, we should be good.
I knew it. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Yeah, I'd be remiss. I know I have several colleagues, former colleagues. Rachel mentioned newly retired. I think by new, that's as in this week. So I know Alex, I saw Angela, I think Richie, Abby, Jack. There may be a couple others. So a shout out to those. And I will say, I know this is kind of Southwest. I will be a little bit New Mexico centric in a couple of my charts. So I do apologize for that. But I did want to kind of lead into this. Well, first off, I want to give definitely a shout out to my former colleague, good friend, Rich Naden. I think many of you know Rich. Rich has really been the stalwart with seasonal outlooks for the Southwest Predictive Services. I've helped Rich over the last 2 to 3 years, but Rich is also, we were hoping to get Rich on today, but had some technical scheduling issues. But a lot of what I will share, at least a couple of the charts that I will share, really came right out of Rich's outlook. So Rich and I coordinate pretty closely, even kind of through the season. So I'll kind of share some of that as we go along here. So I wanted to highlight, we have and hopefully you've maybe seen this in the forecast, another significant pattern change here starting really in a couple days, I think through most of next week. So we're looking at another, especially for, I'll include northern Arizona, northeastern Arizona into that mix, probably even actually down into parts of central Arizona. But especially for northern, eastern New Mexico, we're looking at another several opportunities for widespread wetting precipitation to include high elevation snow. So this is a 10-day, this is just kind of a blend of models as we look out through, I believe this goes through next Saturday, next weekend. So this is going to capture pretty much what we're going to get into weather-wise kind of late this week and then through next week. And really not just the precip, but the temperatures. Next Monday, kind of as this very unusually deep low kind of settled, it's going to be squarely over Phoenix, starting pretty much late Sunday and Monday next week. And I was just looking at numbers yesterday. Highs in Phoenix on Monday will be cooler than places like in the upper Midwest. Kind of low 70s in Phoenix for the early part of May. So very unusual. I mean, obviously we'll take it. Such a welcome change from what we've had, but I'll kind of maybe talk a little bit to offer up some of my thoughts on kind of this active pattern and the adjustment that we've seen, and maybe how that's going to affect. I mean, we're kind of obviously moving into the most critically dry, hottest time in the Southwest in terms of fire season, and so these kind of periodic and somewhat timely shots of cooler temperatures and moisture have helped to certainly delay significant fire activity. So the latest trends, the weak La Nina pattern that was in place for most of this past winter ended It actually peaked back in early February. It was officially declared dead a couple weeks ago, but the overall pattern pretty much faded about the second, third week of February, right as it was peaking. So as I mentioned, these occasional shots of moisture, cooler temps have definitely helped to delay things. That being said, even with the precip that we have had across the Southwest, drought conditions have worsened. Not surprisingly, as we kind of come out of wintertime, the drought monitor tends to reflect that. So we have certainly seen with each weekly update degradation, and we'll kind of highlight some areas, certainly in New Mexico, where we do have still have concern in terms of the dryness. The long-range models, and we're really in a period now where we're talking about sub-seasonal forecasting, meaning the 6 to 10, 8 to 14 day periods. So at that sub-seasonal level, which there's, the skill in that range continues to improve and increase just about every year. And so we can look at updates pretty much on a weekly basis, kind of going forward, that helps inform those updates to that sub-seasonal period. But in general, the long-range models that Rich and I really look closely at, multi-model ensembles, pretty much still trend towards, we say this up and down pattern for May and June. Now, it's the driest for most, especially central western New Mexico into a good part of Arizona. It's the driest, part of the year. So the models have been trending kind of on the drier than average side, but certainly the warmer than average side. Notwithstanding this pattern that we're going to go into, and a singular event like what we're going to experience the next 10 days will drive some significant changes, both in terms, I think, in fuels, and some other aspects that, aren't just captured. So to say that we saw this kind of trend, a couple months ago, not so much, I would say. But I will kind of maybe mention a couple of, clues that might have been in kind of the historical past that kind of support kind of this more active spring, fall in a very dry wintertime. So the good news is that the models continue to support this neutral ENSO pattern right on through the end of the year. So this is the latest update that came out. As I mentioned, we were in a weak La Niña for most of the wintertime, which ended back in February. So we've been in this neutral pattern for about 8 weeks, pretty close to it. And the trends, the kind of the average of all the dynamical models kind of holds us in that sort of neutral territory, as I said, right on through the rest of spring, summer, fall, and into the early part of winter. If you want to, put some numbers to it, it's about a 60 to 70% probability that we'll hang on to neutral conditions for the rest of the year. Of course, as we get, farther out, and you'll see that here in this bar chart from the latest Climate Prediction Center update, better than a 60% probability for ENSO neutral conditions to last through August, so through our meteorological summer. And then obviously with the uncertainty, just as you go farther out in time, but still you can see that those neutral, the neutral bars are a little bit higher than kind of what may be a moderate chance of a weak La Niña returning by the time we get to fall and maybe early winter. But as I just showed, I think the preponderance of model data at this point pretty much supports neutral conditions through the end of the year. Now, what does this mean? This is generally, it's not bad news, right? And so I think this transition into this neutral pattern, it generally takes a couple of months for the atmosphere to respond to the changing conditions in the tropical Pacific. It's not an instant, flip the switch. So I think that is in large part with this kind of active storm track that we've seen across the West, especially the Southwest, is in response to this kind of neutral pattern that's taking hold and is going to be with us for an extended amount of time here. So that's kind of probably a good piece of news there. Let me just kind of highlight April real quick across the Southwest. So it's important to note that, we think about, northern Arizona, Flagstaff, portions of northeastern Arizona along the rim, Four Corners area, the Albuquerque area up to Santa Fe. Yes, I mean, those systems that we had last month were very beneficial and had some pretty significant impact. But there are areas in the Southwest that missed out. And I think in New Mexico specifically, that northeast part of the state has largely missed out. Of course, we're going to fill that in pretty good here the next 10 days. Portions of the Lincoln, much of the Gila has really been left out of the precip last month. And if we go back to the map that I just showed, they're pretty much going to miss out with this kind of pattern coming up through next week. And then you can kind of see in Arizona, again, somewhat of a similar story for southeastern Arizona, especially up to the central valleys there around Phoenix and into the southwest part of the state. So I did a study, gosh, it's been over a decade ago, that folks generally remember the impacts, so you remember, big rain events, big snow events, things like that. And I think it just goes to show that while some of our big population centers in the Southwest have benefited from precip, it's not widespread. And I just wanted to pull this chart out. This is for the Santa Fe airport, just as a quick illustration that we've had more significant precip events during the month of April than we did combined from December 1st through the end of March. So again, when you kind of look at this plot, I mean, we're still in Santa Fe, even with the precip, we're still about 45% below where we should be for this time of year. So I think that's kind of important to keep in mind. So if we go back, the background conditions are historically dry. The December through March numbers on the left, and then the latest drought, and again, a little New Mexico centric here, but I just wanted to highlight, because I'm more engaged with the drought, or was engaged with the monthly drought team, that the extreme drought that was introduced across north central New Mexico a couple of cycles ago, a couple of weeks ago, was the first time that we've seen extreme drought since the end of 23. And then in the Southwest, the exceptional drought, which is a D4 drought, the worst level of drought continues to expand, and we haven't seen exceptional droughts since before we had our very wet monsoon of 22. So in the background, this is kind of what we've been dealing with in terms of the winter and early spring period. And as it turns out that December through March ranked as the driest period on record, 130 years of record for Climate Division 2, so that's north central New Mexico, and also for portions of central New Mexico, to include the Climate Division where Ruidoso resides. As far as snowpack, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things real quickly. This is the Santa Fe Snowtell. This is the highest snowtell in New Mexico. It effectively melted out 2 weeks ago. This snowtell sits up over 11,000 feet near the ski area. And not only did it melt out, now the earliest on record for this particular snowtell, but it melted out almost about 2 weeks, 14 days earlier than the previous record, which was 2006. There's a lot of references in the Southwest to 2018 in terms of 2018 was a very low snow year, pretty much across the entire Southwest. 25, this last chart shows that we dip below that for a lot of areas. And for a lot of areas, it was historically at their mins. So this min trace it can be a collection of years, but for most areas, especially on the New Mexico side, 2006 stands out as one of the minimum snow years in terms of snowpack. So, and then you can see where we should be, the median trace there. Even this time of year at that elevation, we should have a decent amount of snow still. When we look at precip rankings, and just maybe to highlight what Zander showed, and I'm again just pulling out one climate division just for demonstration, illustration here, is that the December through February that just ended was the third driest in that same 130-year period of record. Again, when you add March, it becomes the driest. But when you go back, looking at previous seasons, we had a wet fall last year thanks to that November storm. Our monsoon season last year was also above average for northern New Mexico. We had a dry spring last year despite a wet March. And then, of course, our winter 1 year ago was above average. So again, it's these kind of cycles. And I would argue that when you start looking at the data from, both Arizona and New Mexico, you see these very abrupt, I would say extreme, swings from kind of wet, even at a seasonal level, kind of wet and dry. And I think that's really been something that has, affected much of the region the past, 10 years or so. So the latest models, again, this is a multi-model ensemble. And, it's generally something in terms of just trying to capture some trends that we look at. I wouldn't really focus as much maybe on the details, especially when you look at May here, because this system, this next 10 days is really going to affect how this chart would otherwise, I think, play out. So I want to put a lot of questions mark for May. But in general, look at the trends. And I think the trend here is as we go from May to June, notice that at least in the model world that we lose the dryness pretty quickly from west to east across the Southwest. And then we start to see evidence of that perhaps early monsoon onset for southeastern Arizona, southwestern New Mexico, perhaps, to include areas west of the divide by the time we get to late June, around that kind of first week of July. And there have been historical studies. My former colleague at the Weather Service, Dave Gutzler at UNM, did a study looking at snowpack, low snowpack years in the Colorado Plateau, up in the San Juans. Because generally when you have, low snowpack years, you heat up this time of year very effectively. And it's that building heat kind of in the lower elevations in the Southwest, particularly in the Central Valleys in Arizona, where we get the thermal low and that monsoon circulation begins to develop. And so there is some correlation with that, but the models have been showing this kind of early to at least average onset and perhaps a pretty good start to the monsoon. We'll see how it goes. You'll notice that August, we get a little bit more fractured in terms of the precip signal, but we're going to hang our hat on that June and July forecast. And I want to share a couple of charts here, again, New Mexico centric, but we've kind of narrowed down just, a few weeks ago when Rich and I were kind of looking at some of the numbers. These 3 years really start to fall out in terms of similarities. 1967, which of course, a good number of decades ago, but 2006 and 2017. And so if you take all 3 years, average them out, this is kind of how the springtime fared. So there wasn't a climate division in New Mexico that had above average for either of those 3 months, which again, when we were kind of formulating these updates, a month ago, kind of gave us a little bit of, maybe confidence to kind of keep with this below average trend. But I will kind of isolate 2017. So what I just popped up there is if you take April and May of 2017 in terms of climate indices, the overall pattern, very similar. And it's interesting when you look at what happened in 2017, you'll notice well above average precip for like parts of the Southern Plains, exactly kind of what's playing out as we speak. You'll see an above average for Climate Division 3, which is that northeastern part of New Mexico, kind of a wet signal for much of, the Front Range in Colorado. There's not the Climate Division 2, northern Mexico, it's not tilted wetter than average, but it's not tilted drier. And so I think that's my takeaway, is that kind of what we're seeing here with this pattern shift the last 4 weeks or so is something that we saw, again, back in 2017. So if you're looking for years to kind of go back and just do a little fun, back of the napkin comparison, 06 and 17 might be some fun years to look at. When you look at the monsoon season on the New Mexico side, it was wet across the board all 3 years. If you were in New Mexico in 2006, that was an exceptionally wet monsoon season, not just for New Mexico, but for much of Arizona. So I'll finish just with kind of the usual suspect of slides here. This was Rich's latest published outlook for May, June, July. And again, I'm going to give hats off to Rich, because he did, I think, and again, this was published over a month ago, kind of highlighting this up and down, this transition that we had in April that kind of carried over into May. And notice that, in terms of Rich's outlook, kind of targeting, especially on the Arizona side, cooler. Well, I shouldn't say cooler, but certainly not above average on temperatures for the month, and that's certainly going to play out, I think, as it's looking now. The precip signal, as I said, this event could be super significant. So this dry signal that we saw in May, pretty much may not happen as we thought a month ago. And as we get into our kind of monsoon period, you see that a pretty bullish forecast as we get to the month of July. And then these are the latest CPC updates. These come out the third week of every month. This is the most recent. And again, even our good, the experts at CPC, and I know Rich is on monthly calls with CPC, they certainly shifted the below average signal for precip farther north, the Four Corners, into like the West Slope, eastern portions of the Great Basin. But they obviously hung on to below average precip chances for May for northern Arizona, much of New Mexico. And again, that was posted just a matter of weeks ago. As we look into the core of our May, June, and July period centered on June, that kind of bullseye in terms of the dryness, again, continues to shift north. And we start to see the above average signal appear for the first time in southeastern Arizona, southwestern New Mexico, with kind of the dryness really shrinking across the region, kind of getting displaced, if you will. And as we look at the core of our monsoon period centered on August, the CPC outlook, which was bullish with the previous update back in March, continues to show that trend for July, August, and September. So, I think, again, this is based on historical, trends that we've seen in the past, and also what the models have been showing. And I think I'll end there. These will update, these significant fire maps usually update on the first of every month. I didn't check this afternoon. They may be updated by now. I'll maybe put the link in the chat, but yeah, so I guess I'll stop sharing. Sorry if I run a little bit long on that.
No, and Kerry, if you actually want to leave that that slide up, I think that would be fine.
Okay.
So, alrighty. So if folks have any questions for Kerry or Zander, please put them in the chat. Looks like we have one from Pepe, just saying that forests in northern Arizona are still doing prescribed fire at the moment. Are these late storms and the predicted early monsoon a potential window to manage fires, or is the dry winter too much to overcome?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't, like I said, I think we have some folks on that might be in a better position, but you're right. I know the horseshoe, the RX that was outside of, on the Coconino, yeah, some impressive condition, burning favorable conditions with that just a few days ago. Yeah, I mean, I think with the managed aspect of it, I would certainly think there's always that potential. I think given though, especially like I'm thinking like the Gila in particular, because when I think of managed, I often do think of the Gila on the New Mexico side. And I mean, that is the one part of New Mexico that really the driest, you know, and is really missed out, you know. And I guess you could certainly extend that into southeastern Arizona. So those areas might have a little more limited opportunity. And I would say too, you know, when we get to the onset of the monsoon with our moisture, dry lightning, we've had lightning already in some areas. And so I think, you know, that's also going to be a concern even before we get to, you know, to that sort of deeper monsoon moisture period. So yeah, I don't know. I'm certainly not the expert though in terms of the fuel side.
Yeah, I mean, and looking at like the ERC chart, um, yeah, it might. I mean, it's the right now for sort of the central Arizona district, it's closer to the average, whatever it is, the multiple year average. And so, you know, maybe that gives some hope that managers will feel comfortable to manage some fire. But yeah, I mean, the other piece I think is resource availability. And again, I'm hoping that there are other people who know more about this than I on the call, but just to maybe state the obvious that if you're downsizing federal workforce, you may not have the resources to manage a wildfire. So that could be another factor that plays in.
Alrighty, thanks for jumping in on that one. So this next question is for you, Zander. Just thinking with an ongoing theme of hot and dry, what do you think led to there being fewer acres burned in 2024 than the previous 8 years?
Uh, I, I, there is an ignition factor, right? And that's so stochastic. You just don't know when you're, particularly with human ignition. We know as lightning moves through, but often it's the human ignitions that are driving some of our largest acreages. And so, you know, in some sense, you have the feeling you get lucky if you don't have a human ignition, you know, Memorial Day weekend or something. So I think that's part of it. I think also like looking at where some of those fires were burning, they weren't in some of the higher country where there's sort of more fuel to really get a fire going. Thinking about some of the worst fires in New Mexico recently, things like Hermit's Peak, Calf Canyon, or Las Conchas, where a lot of their kind of engine for growth came from higher altitude stuff that had dried out. And so maybe it overall hot and dry, but maybe this year we got a little bit lucky about when things dried out versus when there was fire danger. Again, thinking about the ERC chart, which I know I seem to be relying on a lot, but during some of our sort of riskiest periods that I think of as sort of May, June, they weren't at those maximum levels. The ERCs weren't at maximum levels. So maybe that's the best answer, but I don't have a great one.
No, I appreciate you jumping in, giving that a go. Alrighty. Pepe came back with another question, just saying, wonder if the pulse of desert fires in 2024 was a product of the wet 2023 to 2024 winter, or the prior 2023 monsoon, or more human emissions. So I don't know how much we want to dive into that, but a few possible causes.
Yeah, and I think that's hopefully that sort of thinking is something that the fire season overviews can help facilitate. I was just going to sort of flip through and think about where some of the those quote unquote desert fires. Well, the Freeman was a natural ignition, right? So we can kind of look back. Fair number of them were natural ignitions, although the siphon fire was human. So yeah, there's more to tease out there, Pepe, and I think those are important questions.
Alrighty, so moving on to another one for you, Kerry. How do you expect the cooler temperatures and forecast for short spurts of precipitation over the next couple of weeks to impact the fire likelihood and severity prior to monsoons?
Well, a couple thoughts on that. I mean, obviously the precip coverage, intensity will be variable as it always is. But just, the cooler temperatures alone, both daytime and kind of our nighttime temps, kind of keeping elevated humidities for extended stretches. We're going to go through, I mean, after today, really, and I think across both Arizona and New Mexico, we won't see highs back at or above average for 7 days. So when Zander talks about the ERCs, that'll have a huge impact regardless of, the precip coverage. So to me, I kind of look at both sides of that in terms of, again, just delaying. I think the inevitable, Mother Nature generally, when we talk about these atmospheric, unusual patterns this time of year, the atmosphere loves to be in a state of balance. Think of seesaw. So when we're on one side, as we will be, the adjustment invariably, and it can happen in short order, will go the exact other direction. So I would not be surprised in 3 weeks, perhaps a little bit less, that we'll be back into a very hot, dry, typical pattern for the late part of May. So that's just generally how, these things tend to behave. So it may only give us a respite of, again, 7 or 10 days, and we'll be right back in it. I know, a lot of the counties across northern New Mexico are in burn, have burn bans. The Santa Fe National Forest went into stage 1 restrictions just a couple days ago. Anticipating as we get, closer to the mid-late part of May, school is out for a lot of, there's more people in areas where that potential for, a start increases significantly. And if we get into a very hot, dry stretch after this unusually cool kind of wetter period, fuel conditions may still be right to carry fire. So, we've already seen, and as I said, as you go into areas that haven't seen the precip so far, especially last month, those areas would be of big concern. So I guess that's my thoughts on it, which are kind of jumbled and not super informative, but we are still, mid-May through mid-June is probably our most critical period in terms of, fire weather conditions in the Southwest. So.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you taking a stab at that. And we just have a couple of minutes left, so time for 1 or 2 more questions. And I'm actually going to just go off of what you finished saying to jump into something that Kerry and Zander, the 3 of us, were talking about this morning, which is asking, is there enough of a pattern with moisture cycles in the Southwest to say that our precipitation seasons are shifting compared to what folks might remember from 30 years ago? And if so, how is that impacting our fire season and smoke loading throughout the spring and summer?
I'm hoping Kerry will answer that one.
There's a lot on that one. I will say that the monsoon season, if we can, generally in the Southwest, we think a monsoon season, that's the end of our large fire season, right? Correlates. Yes, we still have lightning starts and perhaps the managed fires that we talked about earlier, but in general, in my sort of opinion and kind of what I've observed is that our monsoon season just generally has become a lot more fragmented. It stands to reason that if you have an early onset, which we might have this year, and like what we had in 22, an early onset just increases the opportunities to have some active days. And so when you look at the records, you look at the stats and the data, monsoon seasons that have early starts tend to be above average, pretty much across the board. So we have that. But in general, I just think the monsoon season is just a lot more fragmented than it used to be, even 10, 15 years ago. So that's an observation. In terms of the spring precip patterns, yeah, I just, Rich and I, there's a lot of other oceanic indices. The ENSO, that's just one of many. And it seems like each year that goes by, the smart scientists that study this day in, day out kind of learn just a little bit more, in terms of, teleconnections and how it just impacts more of kind of globally. I think everyone, I don't know if you've seen the quote, but ENSO alone, so what goes on in that Niño 3.4 region in the tropical Pacific globally explains about 30% of natural climate variability across the globe. So it is a big dog on the porch. There's no question, which is why we kind of pay attention to it. And again, I would just argue that the transition that we've seen into this neutral ENSO pattern 2 months ago, it has resulted in the overall kind of shift, the large scale shift in the storm track. I mean, that's kind of what it just comes down to. Now, generally in the cool season, so we're talking about, winter, springtime, sometimes like as early as mid to late fall. I mean, those are the periods that are most strongly correlated to kind of what's happening in the tropical Pacific. Things start to fall apart this time of year, and especially as you get into the summertime. So I just think this up and down, keep in mind that we had this time last year, we were in the fading El Niño that we came out of in the winter of 23-24. So like if I were to show you a longer kind of time series, we benefited, from that here in the recent past in terms of springs. But you think about the spring of 22 and some others that were strongly influenced by La Nina patterns in terms of the storm track, and especially with the Southwest. I was telling Zander earlier that, when you look at correlations to ENSO and cool season precip, they're very strong in the Southwest as well as the Northwest. I mean, they're opposite, obviously, but the correlations are very strong. So, yeah, I mean, I just think that, I don't know where I was going with that thought, but I would just say that I think our monsoon seasons are definitely much more just fragmented in general. And it's just like, it doesn't seem like you can count on a really good, solid monsoon season like you used to.
Yeah, maybe can't count on that to be a season-ending event like we used to.
Right.
So, alrighty. I know that we're a couple minutes past the top of the hour. Kerry, if you're able to stay on just a few minutes, we might answer one more question. But for everyone who has to jump off, I just want to thank you for attending the webinar today. Zander, thank you so much for your presentation. And Kerry, who is actually newly retired as of today, We're so appreciative of your many years of work and feel incredibly grateful that you were gracious enough to join us for this webinar. And so everyone online, please join us in wishing Kerry a restful retirement. Alrighty, one last question for you though, Kerry. Do you have any predictions on winds for the upcoming weeks?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, Monday, I would say Monday looked to be kind of the day, but nothing really super extreme. And it's going to be coincident with temperatures that are going to be broadly, 10 to 25 degrees below average, higher humidity, and, with some precip. So not the typical, rip snorting winds that we saw back in March. So, but otherwise, yeah, aside from, I think that Monday, Tuesday, I mean, we're in our windiest time of year in the Southwest, pretty much now through the middle of May. And then we start to tail off as we get towards Memorial Day, historically, in terms of wind. So, but nothing too extreme, thankfully.
Alrighty, thanks for answering that last one. And thank you again so much to both of you for coming on and presenting today. And for everyone online, we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Take care and be well.